Hello and welcome to this edition of NYSE Governance Services Inside Compliance. I'm Erica Salmon-Byrne with NYSE Governance Services Corpedia, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome to the studio today Marc Levy with NYSE as well. He's the head of Global Issuer Services. And Marc, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
For a conversation around NYSE Governance Services generally and the governance space in particular. And I am sure our audience is very excited to hear your thoughts in that area. Many people in the compliance space were surprised when the NYSE acquired Corpedia and sort of made an entree or an additional entree into the compliance and governance space. Can you talk a little bit about the reasons why they shouldn't have been surprised? I mean, the exchange has been a thought leader for a number of years, and so I'm sure our audience would be interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
No, that's exactly right, Erica. In fact, if you think about one of the key roles that we play for the communities that we serve, the role of thought leadership and really setting standards for the organizations and industries we serve has been a long part of our history. And in fact, not to get too technical here, but
oh, you can get as technical as you like.
But we were actually the first to recommend that public companies disclose their financial records and statements publicly as part of our best practices around governance. And we did that, I believe, 40 years before the SEC even came into existence after the Great Depression. So we have a long history of being a standard setter, as being a proponent of best practices around governance and around compliance. And so it was a natural extension of that thought leadership and the desire to promote best practices around all those areas that made the acquisition of Corpedia such a natural step for us.
Mm-hmm. And where does NYSE Governance Services fit within the company itself? You know, there are a lot of people in the ethics and compliance space who are obviously trained as lawyers and may or may not be as familiar with the capital markets as others. So for those who are new to the NYSE as an organization, can you talk a little bit about where the governance services business fits within the company itself?
The governance services business fits within the listings organization. The listings organization is the one that's most closely associated with the traditional NYSE business. It's the trading floor, it's the ringing of the bell, but it's also the organization that helps promote those standards we were just talking about and monitors some of those practices. And so from that perspective, the reason for governance services to be part of that organization is that it gives all participants in the capital markets, particularly the corporations that are very sensitive to those governance and compliance issues, the ability to be part of a community that incorporates over 2,000 companies in the US and an even larger number of companies worldwide, which, if you think about it, being able to be a thought leader and to share best practices is not just a very didactic process. It also involves taking the knowledge of the community and exchanging best practices and having peer exchanges in a way that the companies that participate can learn from each other in a very trusted environment.
And indeed, this show is an example of that.
That's exactly right.
Putting out resources like Inside Compliance, like This Week in the Boardroom, which is, of course, the director-facing program that Corporate Board Member produces on a regular basis. The conferences that we do, the peer-to-peer exchanges, those are all wonderful opportunities for people within the ethics and compliance space to talk to each other and to talk about what best practices look like in those arenas. And then there's also a wonderful opportunity for a knowledge share, it seems to me, between mature companies and companies that are just now thinking about becoming a part of the capital markets. So there's
absolutely a great part of the work, a great portion of the work that we do is actually helping companies before they even become public. And so particularly in the areas of governance and compliance, if you're a private company thinking of perhaps accessing the capital markets and the public markets, in whether it's in the short term or in the longer term, there are probably a number of issues around governance, around compliance that you have not really focused on as part of your growth as an emerging or new business. And so the fact that those companies are also served by our listings group and by our governance services group allows us to share some of that knowledge and best practices with those emerging companies.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you know, we are starting to see a real comprehension on the part of compliance officers that there's a business case to be made around compliance and ethics and governance practices. You know, we're starting to see some really interesting research come out of the some of the academic arena. University of Michigan professors doing research on how your D&O insurance costs less if you have a good governance program, and we're seeing some interesting research on credit ratings, and we're seeing some interesting research on company performance and employee turnover and things along those lines. So having the opportunity to support the listed community with some of that information that helps them perform better as businesses in the long term is obviously another piece of this that makes a nice fit.
Even at a more fundamental level, even if you think about the first main role of the NYSE historically, which has been to provide access to the capital markets and play a very important part in the capital formation process, what we're seeing is we're seeing more and more institutional investors who are on the other side of that capital formation process really starting to focus very hard on governance and compliance practices. Particularly when you start looking at some of the very large public investors, the CalSTRs, the CalPERs of this world, they all have now their own governance and compliance teams that are focusing very heavily on the governance practices of potential companies that they might like to invest in. And it's becoming a very important part of their investment decision process.
Right. Right, and it only makes sense. I mean, if we look at the the average fine size, just to tell the bad story for a moment, if we look at the average fine size, you can see companies lose upwards of 70% of their value of their stock, during the course of a crisis. The latest statistics that I saw were that Walmart is spending $675,000 a day on legal fees related to their anti-corruption investigation. And so, if you're an investor, particularly if you're a large investor and you're looking for smart places to put your money, making sure that the company that you're working with has really effectively mitigated their risks is obviously an important part of that inquiry.
And think about it even from the perspective of, let's say, not a public investor, but a private equity investor, right? You don't only, you have to worry not only about your own compliance practices as a firm, as a private equity investor, but if you're a large one, you have to worry about the inconsistent or different, should I say, very different range of practices around a very large portfolio of company where any one compliance failure or governance failure at one of those portfolio companies could truly damage your entire portfolio. So those are really, really complex issues that I believe companies and investors are going to need more and more education, advice, and benchmarking around.
Right. And that's one of, I think that's one of the important points. We hear from companies a lot, less so, I would say, over the course of the last couple of years, but certainly 3 or 4 years ago, I would hear this all the time. Well, we're not publicly traded, so none of that matters. Or we're not, we're privately held, so I don't have to worry about any of that. And that is very far from the case. Yes, you don't have to worry about Sarbanes-Oxley or Dodd-Frank if you're not publicly traded, but the rest of the regulatory, you still have to worry about fraud, you still have to worry about the FCPA, the DOJ doesn't care, what your corporate structure looks like.
That's right.
If you violated the law, they're going to be looking at your compliance program and saying, what do you have in place? And many of the companies that we can point to that have been some of the biggest fines over the course of the last several years have been companies that were either private equity funded or were privately held. So it's certainly not a situation where just because you're not part of the listed community, you don't have to worry about these things for some reason.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the interesting thing to me about the NYSE Governance Services organization is the combination of Corpedia and corporate board member. And looking at the Corpedia organization, which is always traditionally focused on the compliance officer and what he or she may need to support an effective ethics and compliance program within their organization and then corporate board member, which has been a source of education and advice to directors over the course of the last decade. Combining the two of them, I have my answer to what's compelling about that combination, but I'm curious to hear yours. What's compelling about the combination of corporate board member and Corpedia to the average ethics and compliance officer?
I think it's really compelling for both sides, actually. I think if you talk to any boards of directors today, they are becoming more and more aware that they're personally responsible for or for compliance or governance failures in the firms and companies that they oversee, and so that has become one of their top 3 or 5 issues of concerns in the boardroom. But quite frankly, it's just as important for the compliance officer to be able to have access to data and to benchmarking and to a sets of information that will allow them to go to their board and say, I need to increase my compliance budget in order to put in place the following programs, and here is why you should consider it. Here is some hard data that will show why a company in our class or in our industry really needs to put in place those programs. So I think that the combination of the two businesses makes complete sense, because what we're seeing is, number one, a convergence of awareness of the issues at the very, very top of the organization all the way to the board level, but at the same time, when it comes time to put in place the right programs and the right budgets to put in place those programs, compliance officers still need help in telling the story to their boards of directors and truly understand how to tell it in a way that really resonates with them.
Right. And it's no surprise to me that you and I are very much on the same page at that. The thing that's interesting to me about the combination is corporate board member gives us the opportunity to make sure that we have directors who have the tools to ask the right questions of their compliance officers.
That's right.
So if I'm the chair of the audit committee, I need to know what a good program looks like. I need to know the questions I'm supposed to be asking my compliance officer. And then if I'm a compliance officer, I need to understand how to talk to my board. What do they want to hear from me? How am I going to be able to be as persuasive as possible with people who have a lot on their plate and a relatively short period of time in which to make these decisions? And so giving compliance officers that data-driven toolkit to really make that case to their board, that either they've got the program in place that they need to have, but they need this, that, or the other thing in terms of support from the board, and then helping the board understand their role in the process as well. Because as we've heard from other guests on this program, and as we see in all the regulatory guidance, we saw this most recently in the DOJ, SEC, FCPA resource guide, the tone really starts with the board. And so it's not just that the board is responsible for oversight, the board's also responsible for tone. And if the board needs to understand what that looks like and how they can help support a culture of compliance within the organization. It's very clear that's what the government expects. And so for me, that's the reason why the combination of the two is compelling to to the organizations that we work with. We're getting close to the end of the time we have together, so I have time for just one more question.
Sure.
And I know this is certainly something that I've gotten questions about from people that I've interacted with in the ethics and compliance community, and that is, what does ICE mean for NYSE Governance Services?
Well, obviously I can't comment officially about the ICE merger, especially since the transaction hasn't closed yet. But I can certainly share some, what my personal view is, which is that ICE is a company that has been extremely successful and grown extremely fast by identifying areas of growth very early on, and by making sizable investments in those areas, both organic and through M&A, in order to capitalize on those growth opportunities. And so from that perspective, that makes me feel good, because it's certainly very consistent with what we're doing on the governance services side at NYSE. We believe this is an area where there is an incredible need and where we can provide a significant service in a way that will allow us to grow the business very fast with the right amount of investment and focus.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Inside Compliance, and that you'll come back and see us again next time, where we will once again take the opportunity to unpack an interesting topic in the governance and compliance space in our ongoing efforts to bring education and resources to compliance officers around the globe.